Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of a Shabbat teaching by Rabbi-Cantor Chorny.
I figured that we wouldn't do a normal learning, not a typical learning, not a full source sheet of learning. For the intrepid and loyal people who make it all the way through the High Holy Day season and then also come to Sudash Leishit to learn. I know that a lot of Torah has come at you in the last few days. I feel really lucky during the High Holy Day season, by the way, that because I'm not generally responsible for producing a lot of the Torah, I also feel like I'm marinating in a lot of beautiful and interesting Torah. I've gotten to hear Josh out from two of my fellow clergy, today from Dr. Erica Rothblum, some really beautiful Torah. And I thought that today the learning that we might do, since we should do something learning, should we do some learning on something that's sacred, would be on the topic of new liturgy coming out of the war in Israel. And the reason this came up is because I was on sabbatical for 3 months. And during that time while I was on sabbatical, I had 3 projects that I've been, Brant blinked and missed it, and I came back. During that time, or as my son says, blunk. He says it's the past tense. I blunk, and I missed it. So you blunk and you missed it, Brant. And during that time, I had 3 projects. I was working on my forthcoming book on minding ritual gaps. I'm 4 chapters in. My editor is great and dogged and keeps me working hard. And then I have 2 other projects I'm working on. The new open mikveh in Los Angeles, Ma'aleh Chaim, which is, God willing, going to come over the next few years. The organization's real. The site is TBD. And finally, a project also on lowering the barriers to the expense of producing new Jewish music. And that's a longer-term project, but I'm in the earlier stages of that with some amazing national partners. In doing those projects, those were it, so to speak, but those were projects that I chose lishma, of my own accord, discretionary time to be working on. And for the most part, I completely otherwise disconnected from my work as a clergy person. But there was one exception. The book that I'm working on is through the Rabbinical Assembly, to be, God willing, published through the Rabbinical Assembly. And as a part of the relationships that I'm building within that world, I've been in conversation with the very people who are making decisions real time during this momentous, historic, traumatic time in Israel about what we do with our liturgy, how we adjust it, what we produce. And in particular, what I want to mention is that validity aside, or people's beliefs one way or another about what we should be praying for, one of the few things that keeps us together, uniform, not just nostalgic, but feeling anchored as a movement, is a sense of uniformity about our liturgy. The Rabbinical Assembly itself takes a lot of pride in the publications of our Sidurim. And whether or not you're using the exact same Siddur as another conservative synagogue down the road, the notion is that not only are we reading the same Torah portion as they're reading at Beth Shalom Tzedek B'nai something over in St. Louis or Chicago or Florida, not only are we on the same Parsha cycle, but we're actually reciting the same liturgy, and some of the incredibly thoughtful liturgical shifts and changes that are specific to our movement, to the conservative movement, some of which emanate from this very institution, from some really wonderful and great thinkers, many of whom are members of the Library Minyan. Those changes become universal to the experiences of people who are praying in the setting where that place falls under the umbrella of the conservative movement. And say what you will about movement-based Judaism, where it's coming from and where it's going, in real time, one of the greatest binding factors, synagogue to synagogue, is the notion that when you go into a synagogue, that the Siddur will at least look very familiar, and that the tefillot, the prayers, will also seem familiar too. I find this is particularly important and comes up a lot in the prayers that are built so deeply into our muscle memory because no matter how infrequently you come to the synagogue, it's the changes to those core prayers that we do most often, most frequently each day, that make a difference if they should be shifted. So, for example, the change at the end of the first baracha, the first blessing, at the end of every single Amidah, with the addition of the imahot, of the 4 mothers, which I need to give a lot of credit to, among other people, Rabbi Joel Rembam, for being a great thinker on this front in terms of the defense of the philosophy, the liturgical philosophy, how it wound up the way that it did in our Sidurim. That chatima, that change, Magen Avraham Ufoked Sarah, the notion of just adding that conjoining U and Foked Sarah, represents hundreds of hours of thought, hundreds of spilled pages of ink, of discourse of contemporary rabbis about where it's appropriate and how it's appropriate to change even the most core blessing. And if you go into a synagogue and you are used to saying your whole life one way, Magen Avraham, and there's already a change up at some point in your lifetime, ostensibly the late 90s for many people who have been planted in the conservative movement, that shift to Ufoked Sarah is already a trip up. So the notion that at the very least, that now that you've learned that and it's become core liturgy, if you are a part of the movement that uses Ufoked Sarah and also protects or is the protector of Sarah, that if you've gotten used to that liturgy, that there's a bit of a payoff in the consistency where you go from place to place. Even if there are other legitimate and wonderful ways that our liturgy might be adjusted for the same purpose, to be more inclusive of the important women at the core of our legacy and history, there is a payoff to that consistency. So it's important for there to be liturgy that follows us from place to place and that we can find each place that we go. And this is very difficult in a time of war because of several factors. But number one, when Israel is at war, news is changing in real time and life is changing in real time, which means what we are praying for urgently is also changing in real time. There is one consistent way the Jews have responded to urgent situations in their people. Generally, we'll call them situations of distress. And that is a consistent way of shifting our liturgy to reflect that we are in a moment of distress as a people. Anyone think of at least one way that we do that? Terrible, something befalls our people. We come to Minyan that evening at our synagogue. And what might we do to shift our liturgy in real time? If it's a terrible tragedy that befalls us, El Mali Rachamim could be recited in the appropriate season. And Psalms as well. You put both of those in. So, as Michael points out, Psalms, these 150 poems that are at the core of our canon, right? In the Ketuvim, the part of the Hebrew Bible that contains what we call additional writings. These 50 additional writings, some of them have a fixed place in our liturgy, and we'll look at a couple of things, a couple of places where they get fixed, remind ourselves where they're fixed in our liturgy. But there are specific psalms that are somewhat agreed upon. I'll give you the example, Psalm 121, Isa Einai El Haharim. When I am in distress, where do my eyes go? My eyes, they are lifted to the heavens because perhaps my help will come from God, will come from that place on high. Right? That Psalm 121, Isa Einai, is a very common psalm to be gone to. But in a time of war, it might have been that one synagogue added a prayer for Israel and another added Hatikva and another synagogue added Psalm 121. And then also there's a gap between adding that Psalm 121 in a moment of urgency. Today, the news is terrible, and we'll say this today and we'll say it tomorrow. And now we're in an enduring state of trauma that is deserving of ongoing prayer and is deserving of address with regularity. And what we have to our benefit, I use that word very lightly, but to our benefit, the longer that the situation endures, the more thoughtful time can be given to what the liturgy of this time can be and ought to be. We can give really wonky thought to what verses from our from our biblical canon we might want to pull on? What liturgy might we want to have an addition to? And to eventually create as best as we possibly can with the hopes that someday, b'mehera v'yameinu, soon we will not need to use them. Until that time, to have a sense of consistency in liturgy. I was asked to join the committee that writes that stuff. That was my long intro to say that I was asked to join the committee that writes this liturgy, and as a writer and as a liturgist, it's a really meaningful thing to sit among my colleagues who are doing this work. Right? This is the work of the colleagues who also write the pronouncements and the shared statements by our assembly when, God forbid, there's an attempt on the life of the president, or when something awful happens that's a national, just a natural disaster that may or may not be specific to the Jewish people. That group also takes responsibility for the liturgy of, it doesn't have, I don't know if there's even a name. I think the committee is like the Committee on Liturgy for the Conservative Movement. We don't have a name, but it's a committee. And they address situations in real time. And over the past 3 months and change since my sabbatical began, I've noticed that not only are we responding in moments of urgency and of trauma, but we're also trying to do the work of creating that consistent liturgy, of trying to create something so that when you go from place to place, there is a shared sense of liturgy, both for the sense of familiarity of the people who might not always be in the same place from Shabbat to Shabbat, from day to day, but also for the sake of achdut, of unity. Because there is something very powerful about knowing that it's not just your synagogue that's saying Psalm 121 or a prayer, but all Jews across many, many different communities who are saying something. So we're going to look at two different prayers. One, I wrote. The other was written by Rabbi Karen Rees-Medwed, who is a wonderful, a remarkable colleague in the movement as well. And you'll see how her prayer differs radically from the prayer that I wrote. We'll look at mine first, and then we'll go to hers, because I don't want to look at mine after hers. It's just really good. Okay, so I'll pass these each direction. Okay. One sheet, you should have two sheets in front of you. One says Introduction to Hashkiveinu, a prayer for Erev Rosh Hashanah, and the other says a prayer for the success of the IDF and peace in Lebanon. Okay, so we'll look at the Introduction to Hashkiveinu first. This is meant to be read in interspersed English and in Hebrew. What we'll do is I'd like for us to read it together through, and then I'll ask you some questions about it and point some things out as well. So we'll read from As Yom Tov Descends. All together. As Yom Tov descends, we stand at the gates with bruised and battered souls. We yearn to ask the unanswerable questions, to gather en masse and raise our voices, to cry out, Avinu Malkeinu Kalei Dever, V'cherev V'ra'av Ushvi. Our Father, our King, our Parent, our Ruler, remove from among your people all plagues, all violence, all hunger, all captivity. Here at the precipice of a new year, we plead, may Israel be granted safety and peace under the great tranquil blanket of divine shelter. May the Holy Land be shielded under the watchful eyes of those who neither slumber nor sleep. May Israel be safeguarded by the armor of unwavering allies. May the sounds of thundering rockets be drowned out by the hopeful cries of the shofar. Ufros aleinu sukat shalomecha, spread over us your shelter of peace. Baruch atah Adonai, Holy One of blessing. Hafores sukat shalom aleinu, ve'al kol amo Yisrael, ve'al Yerushalayim. The one who unfurls your shelter of peace over us and all your people Israel, and over Jerusalem. Okay. So a few questions for you. When is this prayer ostensibly meant to be said? When does it appear this prayer is for? Yeah, for Mari, for a holiday, anytime that we recite Hashkiveinu, although as I was pointing out last night at services, I think it could be added anytime that we offer the prayer for Israel, the fuller prayer for the state of Israel, in which we also engage with this phrase, Ufros alei, in that case, Aleha, Sukkot Shalomecha, and may the shelter of peace be unfurled over Israel as a place. What else tells you when this is for? What hints are you getting And what season is this specifically for? Yeah, Jerry.
Fall.
Okay, so there's a lot of references to the notion of Sukkot, right? Of Sukkot and Sukkot Shlomecha, right? And it also engages with Rosh Hashanah. What other context clues are there about when the prayer is meant for? What other liturgy is engaged? Avinu Malkeinu. And when do we say Avinu Malkeinu? High holy days like Rosh Hashanah, the end of Yom Kippur, and on fast days as well. So moments of both distress and also of the high holy days. In this case, I did write at the top the title, A Prayer for Erev Rosh Hashanah. So probably for Erev Rosh Hashanah, but it can be used other times as well. And is this a traditional line from Avinu Malkeinu? Is this in the traditional Avinu Malkeinu? No. Yeah, it is. Sure is. Isn't it interesting how quickly we can look over it? So I went to study Avinu Malkeinu as a core prayer. It is not the full, it's a piskat. It's not the full length of the line, but I break it at a certain place for a certain reason. Avinu Malkeinu, Kale Dever, or Daver, it's possible, V'cherev v'ra'av ushvi. So we're asking God to remove 4 things. Dever v'cherev. Why might I mention Dever and Avinu Malkeinu in this prayer? We got two pieces of liturgy now in conversation with each other. The Hashkiveinu and Avinu Malkeinu. What role does Dever play at that? The plague. If you want to, you can open up, if you have a Siddur near you, open up to page 45, and I'll read out loud the Hashkiveinu for Friday evening. Hashkiveinu Adonai Eloheinu l'shalom v'hamidenu malkeinu l'chayim. Ufros aleinu sukat shlomecha. There's your ufros aleinu. V'taknenu be'etzah tova milfanecha. And v'hoshi'enu lema'an shemecha. Give us your etzah tova, your good counsel. Save us for the sake of your name. V'hagein ba'adenu. And then v'haser. Look at that sum omid on Shabbat. Watch over us. V'haser me'alenu, and remove for us. Another word like kale. Oyev, dever, cherev, ra'av, yagon. V'haser satan milfanenu ma'acharenu. So what does this Avinu Malkeinu line have in common with Hashkiveinu?
It's to remove these bad things from us.
These specific bad things. Why do you think this is a list of bad things that shows up in Avinu Malkeinu and in Hashkiveinu? Dever and cherev, plagues, the sword, right? Violence at the hands of the sword, ra'av and shvi, hunger and captivity.
They were part of the experience of the Jewish people.
This is what happens. Annie Lamott, who I've been reading all summer, they're part of the experience of the Jewish people. And Michael said, I've been reading Annie Lamott all summer. She's an amazing memoirist. And at some point in her early college years, she learned some Nietzsche and decided based on that learning that she wanted to be Jewish. And her friends said, her college like dorm mates said to her, we're going to hire you a bat mitzvah tutor, okay, to this college. We're going to hire you a bat mitzvah tutor. And she said, and the bat mitzvah tutor had many things to teach me. But one of the things that the bat mitzvah tutor wanted to teach me was important questions about what Jews do and do they not do. So she would say to me, do Jews go camping? And I would say, I guess so. And she would say, no, Jews do not go camping because the bad things are already happening to us in here. Why would we go out there and look for more? Right? So that's what I'm thinking of as I think of these are the things that befall the Jewish people eternally. So Michael's pointing out, just repeating for those people who are listening through the online means, that we were so sure that we passed the point of plagues being such a global traumatic incident that we want to mention them in Avinu Malkeinu, that it was removed from our current Siddurim, from Siddur Sim Shalom, from Lev Shalem. And then during the time of COVID, many communities went in search of adding that back in. And that brings me back to what I was going to respond to AJ's point, which is Dever it's really disease. It's not really a plague. Magifah there are other words that are more specifically for plague. What's that? It's one of the plagues, which is why we say plague, but it's not really a plague. It's really a disease that's one of the plagues. Exactly. So what's the difference, though? Now that we're looking at both liturgies, or maybe you're peeking at Hashkiveinu, what's here in Avinu Malkeinu that's not in Hashkiveinu, and why might I have brought it? Right, so both of the prayers are in the imperative form. One says, our Father, our King, do these things for us. And the other says, Hashkiveinu Adonai Eloheinu l'shalom, watch over us, right? Guard over us. Both are pleased with the divine, but they definitely have different flavors. I heard somebody say the thing that's in this Avinu Malkeinu line that's not in Hashkiveinu is Shevi. It's what? Shvuyim. It's captivity. Okay? It's captivity, the shvuyim, the captives, who we've been praying for. So what I'm doing in bringing this in, and I only want to look at this for one more minute, so we can go into the other prayer that I passed out, is that I'm bringing to our attention two pieces of our liturgy that can be in conversation with one another. Hashkiveinu, in and of itself, does not mention and guard us from captivity, possibly because of what Rose is saying, which is that Hashkiveinu was a prayer added to our evening liturgy out of the nightly experience of personal fright, kind of walking in the dark of the world, literally walking without street lamps through the world, and guard over us as as the sun goes down and the world gets dark and a little scarier. Watch out for these things. Avinu Malkeinu, however, mentions in that same line and in that same breath captivity, which is similar to this idea of Magefa, something that for most of Jewish history, for long periods of time, we are able to forget about as something that we need to be worried until all of a sudden it's relevant again. And sometimes those intervals are short and sometimes they're long. I have very strong memories of the years of Gilad Shalit and his family's encampment in Jerusalem, which was still going on at the time when I was living in Jerusalem, both years. And then Shevi was suddenly less relevant after his redemption. It was suddenly less relevant for some years until it wasn't irrelevant anymore, and it was suddenly very relevant again. I want to mention one other thing. The impetus for writing these two prayers, and we'll move to Karen's in just a moment, Rabbi Reese Medwed's prayer as well. The impetus was the impending war in Lebanon, this notion that we didn't know 2 weeks ago what these 2 weeks would look like, and knowing that we might want to have a prayer that turned our eyes to the north of Israel and even further north as well. This is before Iran was even, it was whispers but not shouts of the conversation. So Lebanon was the thing in conversation. So I wanted to invoke the symbolism of Ufros alenu sukat shalomecha for a particular reason. Why are Israelis looking skyward these days?
Because of the rockets, and I assume that this is referring to the Iron Dome and to David's sling and to everything.
Precisely. So the notion is that they're looking skyward at rockets, and that there is an image of a sukat shlomecha, a shelter of your peace, invoking this idea of the kippah, of the domes that exist of protective of airspace protection that have been erected and are ongoing over Israel, and offering this prayer without an explicit reference. It doesn't say, and keep us under the shelter of Iron Dome and David's sling and all of those other specific to this moment. I could have included that too, but instead I chose to lean into the enduring liturgy, which hints at this notion that sometimes we feel like we're under a protective shelter of God's peace, and invokes that imagery. So Rose is pointing out that there is such isolation, such a feeling of isolation in the world, to be Jewish, to be someone who cares about and loves Israel, and to wonder what sort of protection will be out there. And sometimes that protection extends to our questions about what our diplomatic ties, what our allies are going to be willing to do, and what they're going to be able to do as a means of protection. And in times of questioning and loneliness, when it comes to wondering about who will protect us, this liturgy, this style of liturgy, of calling out to the divine, not knowing if our question is answerable or not, but calling upon the divine to be a shelter of peace, is a way that our people have time and time again prayed, even when it's meant something specifically different, depending on the era of our history that we're living in. Nico, and then we're going to move to the other prayer. So Nico's pointing out that there are so many stronger images that might have been invoked in the original liturgy, and it'd be interesting to find out if there are other girsaot, other versions that call upon different imagery, sort of God's divine palace, or might maybe be brought under the shelter of something stronger than wings or a sukkah. But as I pointed out last night, as I spoke briefly and teased this teaching, Sukkot are by definition temporary in order to be kosher. And I think that there is an acknowledgement in this prayer, I'm in agreement with you, that shalom is also a temporary thing. Sukkot shlomecha is a combination of two nouns, a sukkah and shalom, that never last. They're not enduring things. They're intermittent, and we have to come back and pray for them again and again. So I'm with you in that, the imagery being like remarkably soft and fragile. I appreciate that word. So we're going to look at this other prayer by Rabbi Medwed, and then you'll forget about how nice my prayer was, because hers is so super amazing and cool. And bonus points. I mean, it's just, she's remarkable, and she wrote both the Hebrew and the English. We'll spend a few minutes on it, but I have to point out that there is at least one typo on this page. I'm not going to tell you what kind of typo, but it's like a nerdy, interesting typo. So if your brain likes to go to places to see, it's like the Where's Waldo, there's an interesting typo. See if you can catch it and tell me at the end. Okay? Great. Oh, is it in Hebrew or English? I won't tell you any more than it's a typo that's on the front side of the page, because it's more interesting. The answer is actually more complex than is it in Hebrew or in English. So we'll see what comes of it. Yeah, there's the hints on the first page. So she calls it, first of all, tefillah latzlachat sahal. Again, smichut, two nouns for the well-being or luck, the welfare of the army, the Israeli armed forces. Vishalom Lebanon. Okay? So and also peace in Lebanon. She begins with the language Mishaberach Avotenu Avraham Yitzchak v'Yaakov. When can we use the Mishaberach language to begin a prayer?
During the Torah service.
We often use it during a Torah service. What else? Blessings of healing, right? It recalls the Mishaberach Lecholim. The answer is that actually Mishaberach Avotenu, et cetera, is a wonderfully flexible piece of our liturgy, because it's not necessarily utilizing any of the construct of matbeya tefillah, this like fixed liturgy. So this can be said anywhere. Already her prayer is in a much more flexible place. You could offer this at any time. However, I would say it is evocative of the Mishaberach imagery we use often when the Torah is on the table. Mishaberach Avotenu Avraham Yitzchak v'Yaakov Sarar Yikar Rechav Leah. I won't get too into it because I'll get too distracted, and we have to turn to Mariv in just a moment. But historically speaking, we've often also called upon other ancestors than these ancestors in particular when it comes to the state of Israel. We've called upon like David and Shlomo and others of our heroic ancestors. I have theories about why that is, but she goes straight to the most familiar, calling upon our ancestors. Hu yavarech et chayalei tzava ha'hagana liYisrael ve'anshei kochot habitachon. Is this language familiar to people?
Yeah, this is standard liturgy for the prayer. It's all done by the chief rabbinate.
This is the standard liturgy that was set and is done by the chief rabbinate of Israel. That's correct. So kochot habitachon is a way of referring to the other security forces, because tzahal in and of itself doesn't necessarily capture the full picture of who is protecting the state of Israel. Ha'omedim.
Because it's the standard altar.
So, as Michael was pointing out, this wasn't the mistake that I was looking for, but it was something I was going to point out.
There is now over the border of Lebanon.
Right. So migvul halavana means from the point of the border. Givul is like a boundary. Lebanon, the Ad Midbar Mitzrayim, and unto the desert of Egypt. What's the word in English? Umin hayam hagadol ad lavo ha'arava be'abasha ba'avir uvayam. What I will say in defense of Karen in terms of this traditional liturgy is two things. Number one, it's just the language that we use even when our forces have gone over the border into Lebanon, and therefore, maybe it's fine that it doesn't specifically speak to this moment when now we've crossed over the border. Number two, interestingly, is that this really seems to be a somewhat contemporary version of what we call a merism. And a merism is when we say like in Ve'ahavta, Uvshoch becha uvkumecha is one of the examples of a merism. In your lying down and in your rising up, that you should be praising God. Does that mean literally when you're lying down, when you're rising up? Some of the rabbinic threads seem to think so, because they just fixed Shema 2 times a day, but more likely than not, it's poetic language to say, we're saying north, south, east, west. We're naming the expanse. It's meant as a poetic merism and all-inclusive and an expansive way of imagining where we are asking for the protection. So that's my thought. So she adds the Acheinu at the end, and my guess is when she ends the prayer with Acheinu, which comes from our daily liturgy after we put the Torah away, my guess is she got there and then went back and added Avir, the notion of also asking for protection in the airspace, but I'd have to ask her. Our Siddur is not in as advanced in aerospace technology as Israel is. So, okay. So very quickly, because I want to end this over the next minute, I want to point out something that she does, and I'm not going to be able to go through every verse, but I want us to quickly look through the page and see the references that she is pulling upon. So this is this particular moment as there was an impending war in Lebanon. She says, Kol Adonai shaver arazim v'shaber Adonai et arzei halvanon. When do we sing this? It says right there, Psalm 29, excellent. And when do we sing that? Every week? Right, Shabbat, when we're putting away and also on Kabbalat Shabbat, and Friday night services right before the Chadodi, and then Hagein Adonai al Chayalinu v'Hagber al Hatzlachot Pilatinu B'Tzafon ve'ad Lebanon, and it's interesting they translate it as through Lebanon. It's really up to, anyway, to Michael's point, it's really up to the border. And then she brings in another verse. Skip your eyes down to, as the psalmist in Psalm 29 reminds us, Sadi katamar yifrach ke'erez balvanon yiskeh. Anyone? Where's the mistake?
Yeah, also Kabbalah Shabbat.
Where's the mistake, though? There's a mistake.
Sorry.
It's a very funny mistake. No, it's fine. But anyone notice? That's not Psalm 29.
92.
It's Psalm 92. So it's like a copy paste from above, but it's interesting. It's yet another different piece of liturgy that we also say on Friday evenings. Psalm 92, the Psalm for Shabbat, Sadi katamar yifrach ke'erez balvanon yiskeh. And then continues with her own language of Shemor al kol maginei artzeinu, all the ones who protect our land. Flip to the other side, hafked, nurture, she ends the sentence with ke arzei halvanon, that they should thrive as the cedars of Lebanon, invoking that language from Psalm 92. Kishehem nichnasim b'shalom v'chozrim b'shalom, reminiscent of other language that we use of leaving and coming in peace. And then she brings in Psalm 104, Yispeu atzei Adonai arzei Lebanon asher nata, that the trees of God drink to satiation. Is that what we call it? Satiety? No. When you're not thirsty anymore. There's another word. Satiation. Okay, great. But these are the cedars of Lebanon that God planted. So the notion of God's presence being an enduring presence that was planted into Lebanon just alongside the trees. And finally, skipping to the very bottom of the page, since we're running out of time to look at every source, she ends with the liturgy of Acheinu Kol Beit Yisrael HaNetunim B'Tzara. This is the exact unchanged liturgy, copy and paste, the traditional liturgy that we use from day to day. I'll end with this because I'm already over the time I would normally teach in. 3 points that I want to make about liturgy. Number 1, anyone could have written these prayers beautifully, and they would have been just as authentic and valid as they are because I wrote one and because my colleague, Rabbi Karen Rees-Medwed, wrote the other one. It's not about the provenance of where a prayer comes from. It's the content of the prayer that matters. And one of the things I'd like for you to take away from this is that the prayers that we are offering in this time derive their meaning from the spontaneous or contemporary pull that they take on our modern situation. They do a dance between the traditional liturgy and the moment that we're sitting in. We are all permitted to be inventive in our prayer, and also to go back to the more traditional liturgy so that we can feel we're rooted in that liturgy as well. Number 2, liturgy is both flexible and inflexible. Michael made a couple of really salient points along these lines. Already there's something almost passé about the language here because it seems to not acknowledge the current situation. But of course, everything that's printed in this book is passé in one way or another. And part of the job of the Jewish people is to dance the dance, again, a value tension between wanting to constantly create contemporary liturgy that addresses our current situation and leaning on the liturgy of our past and finding and deriving new meaning in it, such that when we sing Achenu called B'nai Israel, that we get from that a different meaning than someone got 10 years ago, because here we are and here we sit and we are hearing the news that we're hearing today. The final thing that I'll add is that the job of liturgy is the job of writing new liturgy. It's an endless project. There is no end to writing liturgy, and the idea that we print liturgy in books so that people have access to it is a wonderful one, but that shouldn't distract from the fact that liturgy itself is an ever evolving plane, and that it is always kosher for us to be looking for new ways to praise, to beg, to ingratiate ourselves, to acknowledge the moments that we're in. The authenticity lent to those prayers comes from the way that they root themselves in other pieces of our canon and of our liturgy, and that lends them a sense of Kedusha, a sense of holiness as well. And I really do pray for the day where we're no longer scrambling to write new liturgy that addresses new situations day in and day out. Yes, Brant. So given that Shabbat is about to end, and I want to turn to Mari before it's too late to turn to Mari, but I'll say this in response to Brant's question, which is a brilliant one and a very difficult one. What is our role in praying for offensive warfare? And I think the answer is this. There is a reason that these prayers are so long and invoke so many different verbs of guardianship, shelter, protection, etc. Because we don't even know what we're asking for. Not only do the armed forces not know what they're asking for, we don't really know what we're asking for apart from peace. Along that way, we're asking for whatever we can humanly understand we're asking for. Guard the forces. Frustrate the designs of those who would come and try to entrap and ensnare the innocent. Release people who are bound in captivity. The things that we do feel sure about. But I think that the less sure we are about what it means to pray for success, the longer our prayers get, to try to figure it out and tease it out.
Come up with what success looks like.
The day that we can come up with one idea of what success looks like, then Mashiach will come.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.